The ceremonial arena had to be perfect, every stone polished until it gleamed like silver under the morning sun, every weapon rack arranged with military precision, every banner hanging straight and proud. Lyra's hands were raw from scrubbing, her knees ached from kneeling on unforgiving stone, but she didn't dare stop. Not today. Not when the Alpha King himself would stand on these very stones and demonstrate his dominance over the ancient war beast Fenrix. "You missed a spot," Seraphina's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sweet on the surface but sharp enough to draw blood. The future Alpha Queen stood at the arena's edge, resplendent in royal blue silk that marked her claimed status, her perfect golden hair catching the light like a crown. Everything about her screamed power, from the confident tilt of her chin to the way lesser pack members automatically stepped aside to make room for her passage. Lyra kept her eyes down, focusing on the stone beneath her bleeding hands. "Where, my lady?" "Everywhere." Seraphina's laugh was crystalline and cruel. "But don't worry, little servant. Today you'll finally witness what true power looks like. You'll see your Alpha King command respect from a creature that has served the royal bloodline for 500 years. Perhaps then you'll understand exactly where you belong in the natural order of things." The implication was clear. Lyra belonged at the bottom, scrubbing stones and accepting insults with practiced silence. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, being treated as less than nothing, and today would be no different. Except today, hundreds would gather to watch Alpha King Darius demonstrate the kind of power she could never hope to possess. "Yes, my lady." The words tasted like ash, but Lyra had learned long ago that survival meant swallowing her pride along with everything else. Seraphina's smile widened, revealing teeth as sharp and white as a predator's. "Good girl. Make sure the viewing stones are spotless too. We wouldn't want anyone to miss the spectacle." She turned away in a swirl of silk and superiority, leaving Lyra alone with her rag and her shame. The viewing stones. Of course. Lyra dragged herself to her feet, ignoring the protest from muscles that had been working since before dawn. The amphitheatre's stone benches rose in perfect concentric circles around the central arena, designed so every member of the pack could witness displays of power and dominance. Today they would all see their Alpha King bend the legendary Fenrix to his will, and they would see Lyra cowering in the corner where she belonged. Her wolf stirred restlessly inside her chest, a weak and pathetic creature that had never shifted properly, never shown the strength expected of pack members. Even her own inner beast seemed to understand its worthlessness. Other wolves could shift into magnificent creatures of power and grace. Lyra's wolf felt more like a sickly puppy, whimpering and hiding whenever danger approached. The sun climbed higher as Lyra worked, each ray of light highlighting the magnificent arena that would soon host the most important ceremony of the season. Pack members began arriving early, their voices carrying across the stone in excited whispers about the ancient beast they would witness. Fenrix. Even his name carried weight, spoke of legends and power that stretched back through centuries of royal bloodline. Look at her, still scrubbing like the good little servant she is. The voice belonged to Marcus, one of the younger alphas who delighted in tormenting those beneath his station. His companions laughed as they settled onto the viewing stones Lyra had just finished cleaning, their boots leaving fresh marks on her work. "Think she'll faint when she sees real power?" another voice chimed in. "I heard she's never even seen a proper shift." "Probably piss herself," Marcus snorted. "Some wolves just aren't meant for anything more than manual labour. Look at her, skin and bones, can't even keep her hands clean." Lyra's cheeks burned, but she kept working. Let them laugh, let them mock. She had survived worse than their casual cruelty, and she would survive this too. The stones needed to be perfect, and she would make them perfect, because that was what was expected of her. That had always been enough. More pack members filtered into the arena as the morning progressed, their conversations growing louder and more animated. Children ran between the benches, playing games of Alpha and Omega, while their parents discussed politics and bloodlines and the significance of today's ceremony. Everyone belonged here except Lyra, who belonged nowhere but in the shadows, invisible until someone needed something cleaned or moved or disposed of. The great bell tolled noon, its deep bronze voice echoing across the arena and the surrounding compound. Lyra felt her stomach clench with nervous energy that had nothing to do with hunger. The ceremony would begin soon. Alpha King Darius would arrive in all his terrifying glory, and she would finally understand what it meant to witness true dominance. Heavy footsteps echoed from the arena's main entrance, boots striking stone with authority that made Lyra's weak wolf cower deeper inside her chest. Elder Keeper Magnus emerged from the shadows, his ancient staff clicking against the stones as he walked. The old man's eyes were sharp as winter starlight, missing nothing as he surveyed the preparations. Those piercing eyes found Lyra crouched beside the weapon racks, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, he simply stared at her. Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or surprise. But before Lyra could puzzle out his meaning, Magnus turned away to inspect the ceremonial circle carved into the arena's centre. "The stones shine well today," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, prepared by hands that understand the weight of sacred ceremony. Lyra blinked in surprise. Was he speaking to her? No one ever acknowledged her work, let alone praised it. She opened her mouth to respond, but Magnus had already moved on, his staff clicking its way toward the great gates that would soon open to admit the Alpha King himself. The crowd's chatter died to whispers, then to absolute silence as the ceremonial horn sounded 3 long, mournful notes. The Alpha King was coming. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the corner beside the weapon racks, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Today she would witness power beyond her comprehension, and she would remember her place in the natural order of things. The horn's echoes faded into stillness so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of pack members sat frozen on their viewing stones, every eye fixed on the great entrance where their Alpha King would soon appear. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited in the shadows, knowing that everything was about to change. She just had no idea how completely. The silver light blazing from Lyra's transformed form began to settle into a steady, otherworldly glow as the magnitude of what had transpired slowly sank into the consciousness of every witness. The impossible had become reality before their eyes. The ancient ceremony designed to demonstrate the Alpha King's dominance had instead revealed the return of bloodline royalty that predated their current dynasty by centuries. Magnus raised his ancient staff high above his head, the weathered wood gleaming with runes that pulsed in harmony with the supernatural energy still crackling through the arena. His voice rang out with the authority of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, who understood the weight of the moment they were all experiencing. "The ancient ceremony is complete," he announced, his words carrying across the silent amphitheatre with supernatural clarity. "Fenrix has chosen his sovereign, the mate bond has been acknowledged, and the silver bloodline has returned to claim its rightful place in our world. Let none question what the gods themselves have decreed through signs that cannot be denied or ignored." A ripple of movement began in the viewing stones as pack members slowly, tentatively, began to rise from their seats. The transformation they had witnessed was so profound, so completely outside their understanding of natural law, that many seemed unsure how to respond. But as the reality settled into their minds, recognition began to dawn on face after face. Alpha Marcus was among the first to kneel, his earlier outrage replaced by awe and something that might have been shame. "My queen," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the supernatural stillness. "I spoke in ignorance of your true nature. I offer my service and my pack's loyalty to the silver bloodline." The gesture triggered a cascade of similar responses throughout the crowd. Pack nobles who had dismissed Lyra as worthless began dropping to their knees, their voices joining in acknowledgement of sovereignty they had been too blind to recognize. Children pressed forward against their parents, wide-eyed with wonder at witnessing legend come to life before them. But it was the ordinary pack members, the servants, the guards, the workers who had lived alongside Lyra in invisibility, whose reactions carried the most profound impact. They knelt not out of political necessity, but out of recognition of someone who had endured what they endured, who had survived in the shadows and emerged blazing with power that could protect rather than dominate. Fenrix positioned himself at Lyra's side like a living mountain of fur and muscle, his molten gold eyes surveying the crowd with ancient satisfaction. The legendary war beast had waited 20 years for this moment, and his patient devotion was finally being rewarded with the acknowledgement his true sovereign deserved. His presence made it clear that anyone who threatened the Silver Queen would face consequences that stretched back through 5 centuries of protective service. Seraphina remained collapsed among the broken stones, her torn royal blue gown and bloodied face a stark reminder of how completely the political order had been overturned. Guards approached her cautiously, unsure whether she should be helped or arrested for her attempted attack on royal blood. The woman, who had spent years positioning herself as the future Alpha Queen, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of opposing supernatural truth. Darius stood beside his acknowledged mate, his powerful presence serving as both protection and declaration. The golden thread of their bond was visible now to anyone with supernatural senses, pulsing with warmth and recognition that could not be severed by human politics or social convention. His wolf had finally settled into contentment, no longer fighting against obligations that had always felt artificial and forced. "Rise," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that made even the ancient Magnus pause in respect. "All of you, please rise. I have spent my entire life invisible in the shadows, and I will not rule from a position that requires others to kneel before me." The words carried such genuine compassion, such understanding of what it meant to be overlooked and dismissed, that the crowd began to stand with expressions of wonder and growing loyalty. This was not a queen who would rule through dominance and fear, but one who understood the value of every soul under her protection. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face showing profound satisfaction at how perfectly his careful orchestration had unfolded. "The coronation ceremony will need to be prepared, of course, along with the formal mating ritual that will bind the gold and silver bloodlines in legal as well as supernatural union. The kingdom must be officially informed of what has transpired here today." Plans began to crystallize around the transformed reality. Messengers would need to be dispatched to every corner of the realm, carrying news of the Silver Queen's return. Political alliances would need to be renegotiated now that the entire power structure had shifted. Most importantly, the ancient laws governing royal bloodlines would need to be restored after decades of dormancy. Lyra felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a mantle she had never expected to wear. Hours ago, she had been scrubbing stones and accepting insults with practiced silence. Now she stood acknowledged as queen by supernatural authority, destined to rule beside the most powerful alpha in the known world. But as overwhelming as the transformation was, she no longer felt alone. The mate bond connecting her to Darius pulsed with warmth and strength, reminding her that she would not face the challenges ahead in isolation. Fenrix's ancient presence offered wisdom and protection that had served royal bloodlines for centuries. Most importantly, the silver light flowing through her veins carried the accumulated strength of every queen who had come before her. The pack members began to disperse slowly, their excited voices carrying news of the day's events to every corner of the compound. Children ran ahead of their parents, eager to share stories of the servant girl who had blazed with starlight and been claimed by the Alpha King himself. Guards moved to escort Seraphina away, her attempted assassination having branded her as a traitor to the crown. As the arena gradually emptied, Lyra found herself standing in the centre of the ceremonial circle, where everything had changed. Silver light still flickered around her transformed form, marking her as something beyond the ordinary world of pack politics and social hierarchy. She was no longer hiding in the shadows, no longer accepting worthlessness as her natural state. She was a queen acknowledged by supernatural authority, claimed by her destined mate, protected by ancient powers that had waited decades for her awakening. The girl who had cleaned these very stones that morning was gone forever, replaced by someone magnificent and terrible, and absolutely unstoppable. The silver bloodline had returned, and the kingdom would never be the same. The royal chambers were quiet now, a sanctuary of peace after the chaos that had transformed their world in the span of a single afternoon. Lyra stood by the tall windows that overlooked the kingdom spread below, silver light still flickering softly around her transformed form like captured starlight. The view that had once been forbidden to someone of her lowly status now belonged to her by right of bloodline that predated the very stones beneath her feet. Darius approached from behind, his footsteps silent on the ancient carpets that had been walked upon by generations of royalty. The mate bond between them hummed with contentment now that they were finally alone together, free from the watching eyes and political pressures that had defined their public lives for so long. His wolf had settled into perfect peace, no longer fighting against obligations that had always felt artificial and wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle with concern as he came to stand beside her at the window. "Today has been overwhelming for everyone, but especially for you. This morning you were invisible, and now the entire kingdom knows your name." Lyra leaned into his presence without conscious thought, drawing comfort from the warmth and strength he offered so freely. The golden thread connecting their souls pulsed with shared emotion, wonder, terror, hope, and something deeper that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost in the wilderness. "I keep expecting to wake up," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 20 years I believed I was nothing, accepted that worthlessness was my natural state. How do you learn to be someone completely different when everything you thought you knew about yourself was a lie?" Darius turned to face her fully, his golden brown eyes soft with understanding and something that might have been regret. "I felt your pain every time we passed in the corridors, every time I saw you accepting insults that should have been treason. My wolf was calling to you from the first moment we met, but I was too bound by duty and politics to understand what it meant." The confession hung between them like a bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding that had kept them apart. Lyra reached up to touch his face, marvelling at the freedom to offer comfort to someone who had once seemed impossibly beyond her reach. The Alpha King, who had commanded respect from creatures of legend, was vulnerable with her in ways that no one else would ever witness. "You couldn't have known," she said softly, her thumb tracing the strong line of his jaw. "The enchantments were designed to fool everyone, including me. Even now, I can barely comprehend the power flowing through my veins, the memories surfacing of a childhood filled with magic and love that I had completely forgotten." Through the tall windows they could see Fenrix pacing the courtyard below, his massive form moving with the patient vigilance of a guardian who took his duties seriously. The ancient war beast had positioned himself where he could watch all approaches to the royal chambers, ensuring that nothing could threaten his newly acknowledged sovereign, while she adjusted to the magnitude of her transformation. Darius followed her gaze to the legendary creature below, and something like awe flickered in his expression. "He knew," he said quietly. "From the moment he emerged into the arena, Fenrix knew exactly who you were. 5 centuries of serving royal bloodlines, and he recognized truth that all of us were too blind to see." "My mother must have brought me to him when I was very young," Lyra mused, fragments of buried memories surfacing like jewels pulled from deep water. I can almost remember being held up to touch his great head, hearing her voice telling me that he would always protect the silver bloodline, no matter how dark the world became around us. The memory carried such profound emotion that tears began to gather in her star-bright eyes. 20 years of believing herself orphaned and alone, when in truth she had been surrounded by protection and love that had been hidden but never destroyed. The enchantments had been cruel in their necessity, forcing her to forget everything that might have sustained her through the worst of her suffering. Darius drew her into his arms with infinite gentleness, offering the kind of comfort that could only exist between destined mates who understood each other's deepest wounds. The embrace felt like coming home, like finally finding the missing piece of herself that had been aching with loneliness for far too long. "I promise you this," he said fiercely, his voice carrying the weight of an oath that would bind him for the rest of his life. "You will never be invisible again. You will never accept insults or cruelty as your natural lot. You will never doubt your worth in my presence, because I will spend every day showing you exactly how magnificent you are." The words wrapped around her heart like healing balm, soothing wounds that had festered in darkness for 2 decades. Lyra buried her face against his chest, breathing in his scent and allowing herself to believe that safety was possible, that love could exist without conditions or political calculations. "I'm terrified," she admitted against the warm strength of his embrace. "What if I'm not strong enough to be the queen they need? What if the power in my bloodline isn't enough to heal the damage that's been done by years of hiding and deception?" Darius pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands framing her face with reverent care. "You survived 20 years of being told you were worthless, and you emerged with compassion intact instead of bitterness. You have power that can reshape our world, but more importantly, you have a heart that will use that power to protect rather than dominate. That combination makes you exactly the queen our kingdom needs." Outside their sanctuary, the kingdom was already beginning to adjust to the new reality. Messengers rode through the night carrying news of the Silver Queen's return to every corner of the realm. Political alliances were being quietly renegotiated as noble families recognized the shift in power dynamics. Most importantly, hope was spreading among the ordinary citizens who had witnessed their new queen's compassion and understood that change was coming. But here in the quiet intimacy of the royal chambers, none of that mattered as much as the golden thread binding 2 souls who had finally found each other. Lyra felt the last of her resistance crumble as she accepted not just her bloodline, but the love that had been waiting for her to claim it. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying all the wonder and terror of someone speaking truth that could reshape everything. "I don't know how that's possible after everything that's happened today, but I feel it burning in my chest like the silver light that awakened with my power." Darius's smile was radiant with joy and relief and something deeper than mere happiness. "I love you too, my Silver Queen. I have loved you since the moment my wolf first recognized its mate, even when I was too foolish to understand what that recognition meant." The mate bond flared between them with golden warmth that sealed the confession like a sacred vow, binding them together in ways that transcended politics or bloodlines or royal duties. They were no longer alone in a world that had tried to keep them apart. They had found each other at last, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 months had passed since the day that changed everything, and Queen Lyra stood on the royal balcony overlooking a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the rigid hierarchy that had once defined their world. The morning sun caught the silver highlights in her hair and made her star-bright eyes gleam with contentment that would have been unimaginable during her years of invisible servitude. Below in the courtyards, children played games where silver queens rescued kingdoms and ancient beasts chose the worthy over the powerful. The stories had already become legend, passed down through excited whispers and growing with each telling. But more importantly, the changes ran deeper than mere entertainment. Pack members who had once accepted cruelty as natural now stood straighter, spoke with more confidence, understanding that worth was not determined by social status alone. The coronation had been magnificent beyond description, with representatives from every corner of the known world coming to witness the return of the silver bloodline. The mating ceremony that followed had been equally spectacular, binding gold and silver bloodlines in union that restored balance to powers that had been fractured for far too long. But it was the quiet moments like this that Lyra treasured most, standing in morning sunlight with the mate bond humming contentedly between her and the man who had chosen supernatural truth over political convenience. Fenrix paced the gardens below, his massive form moving with the satisfaction of a guardian whose vigil had finally been rewarded. The ancient war beast had become something of a celebrity among the children, who brought him treats and listened wide-eyed to stories of his centuries of service to the royal bloodlines. His presence served as a living reminder that truth could not be suppressed forever, that recognition would always find its way to the surface when the time was right. Darius emerged from the royal chambers behind her, his footsteps silent on the stone, but his approach announced by the golden warmth that flowed through their bond. His arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned into his embrace with the kind of trust that could only exist between souls who had found their perfect match. "The morning reports," he said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction that mirrored her own contentment. "Trade agreements with 3 neighbouring kingdoms, requests for audiences from noble families who want to pledge allegiance to the silver throne, and a proposal from the Healers' Guild to establish a new school of magical arts." The kingdom was thriving in ways that none of them had dared to imagine. The return of the silver bloodline had awakened dormant magical abilities throughout the realm, as if Lyra's transformation had given others permission to acknowledge powers they had always possessed but never dared to use. Healers were stronger, seers more accurate, elemental mages more controlled in their abilities. "And the other matter?" Lyra asked softly, her hand drifting unconsciously to her still flat stomach where new life was just beginning to take root. Darius's arms tightened around her with fierce protectiveness and wonder. "The court physician confirmed what we suspected. Our heir will be born with the spring flowers, carrying both gold and silver bloodlines united for the first time in centuries. The child will be the bridge between old power and new, destined to rule over a kingdom where magic flows freely and worth is measured by character rather than birth." The news had been their private joy for the past week, shared only between them and the ancient powers that had orchestrated their union. A child born of the mate bond, carrying the combined strength of bloodlines that had been kept apart by politics and fear for far too long. The very thought filled Lyra with wonder that still felt too magnificent to be real. Movement in the courtyard below caught their attention as a familiar figure approached the palace gates. Seraphina walked slowly across the stones she had once commanded as future queen, her head held high despite the simple travelling clothes that marked her reduced status. Exile had been merciful compared to the treason charges she could have faced, but the woman who emerged from disgrace carried herself with something that might have been wisdom, earned through devastating loss. "She's leaving for the Eastern Territories today," Darius observed, his voice carrying neither anger nor satisfaction, only the kind of detached compassion that came from understanding that some lessons could only be learned through complete defeat. Lyra nodded, watching as Seraphina paused in the centre of the courtyard to look up at the royal balcony. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment time seemed suspended between past and future, between what had been and what would never be again. Then Seraphina offered the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Not submission, but recognition that the better queen had prevailed. "I hope she finds peace," Lyra said softly, meaning every word despite the woman's attempt to murder her in front of hundreds of witnesses. Perhaps exile will teach her that worth cannot be claimed through politics or inherited through bloodline alone. It must be earned through service to something greater than personal ambition. The response was so characteristic of the Queen. Lyra had become compassionate without being weak, understanding without being naive, powerful without being cruel. She ruled not through dominance, but through the kind of strength that protected the vulnerable and elevated the overlooked. The silver bloodline's gift had always been healing rather than conquest, and she wielded that power with wisdom that amazed even those who had known her longest. Pack members below began their daily routines, but many paused to wave up at the royal balcony where their queen stood in morning sunlight. Children called out greetings that she answered with genuine warmth, their voices carrying the kind of joy that only existed in kingdoms where the rulers truly cared about the welfare of their people. "Do you ever miss it?" Darius asked quietly, his voice carrying curiosity rather than concern. The simplicity of invisibility, the safety of being nobody important enough to threaten or target. Lyra considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved, remembering the girl who had scrubbed stones and accepted insults as the natural order of things. That person felt like someone from a different lifetime, someone who had existed before she understood what she was capable of becoming. "I miss the illusion of safety," she admitted honestly, "but I could never go back to believing I was worthless, not after feeling the power that flows in my veins, not after understanding that I was loved even when I couldn't love myself. The girl who cleaned these stones was surviving, but she wasn't truly living. I am living now." The words carried the weight of transformation that went far deeper than supernatural awakening or political elevation. This was the voice of someone who had reclaimed not just hidden power, but fundamental self-worth, who had learned the difference between existence and authentic life. The mate bond pulsed between them with golden warmth as Darius pressed a kiss to her temple, sealing the moment with tenderness that still made her heart race despite months of such intimacy. They stood together overlooking a kingdom that was being reborn through their union, watching their people thrive under leadership that valued compassion over conquest. Fenrix's roar echoed across the courtyards, not a sound of threat or dominance, but of pure contentment as he settled into his favourite sunny spot for his morning rest. The ancient war beast had finally found the queen worthy of his centuries of devotion, and his satisfaction was infectious, spreading through the kingdom like ripples on still water. "What are you thinking about?" Darius asked, reading the contemplative expression that had settled over her features. Lyra smiled with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from understanding exactly where she belonged in the world. "I'm thinking about the girl who believed she was nothing, who accepted worthlessness as her natural state, who thought love was something that happened to other people. She never could have imagined standing here, carrying the next generation of united bloodlines, ruling beside her destined mate over a kingdom that values truth over convenience." The silver light that had blazed so dramatically during her awakening now flickered softly around her transformed form, as natural as breathing, as integral to her identity as the love that bound her to the man who had chosen her over political alliance. She was no longer hiding from who she was meant to be. She was exactly where she belonged, and the kingdom was better for her presence in ways that would echo through generations yet to come. The Silver Queen had found her place in the world, and nothing would ever be the same. The great gates groaned open with the weight of destiny itself, their ancient hinges singing a song that had announced royalty for 1,000 years. Alpha King Darius stepped into the ceremonial arena like a force of nature given flesh, his presence so overwhelming that the very air seemed to thicken around him. Power radiated from his massive frame in waves that made every wolf in the amphitheatre instinctively bare their throats in submission. He wore the ceremonial armour of his bloodline, black steel etched with silver runes that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in sharp, blinding flashes. His dark hair was pulled back to reveal the strong lines of his face, all sharp angles and controlled authority. But it was his eyes that commanded absolute attention, golden brown like molten amber, holding the kind of ancient wisdom that came from ruling creatures who could tear a man apart with their bare hands. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the shadows beside the weapon racks, her weak wolf whimpering at the sheer magnitude of power walking across the arena stones. This was what an alpha looked like. This was what strength incarnate looked like when it moved through the world with absolute confidence in its own dominance. Seraphina rose from her position of honour on the viewing stones, her royal blue gown flowing around her like water as she moved to greet her intended mate. The sight of them together should have been perfect, two beings of extraordinary power claiming their destined place at the apex of the pack hierarchy. She was everything a future Alpha Queen should be, beautiful, powerful, born to rule beside the most dangerous man in the kingdom. My king! Seraphina's voice carried the musical quality of someone who had never doubted her own worth, never questioned her right to stand beside absolute power. She inclined her head just enough to show respect without diminishing her own status. "The ceremony awaits your command." Darius acknowledged her with a slight nod, but his attention was already moving beyond her to survey the arena and its assembled witnesses. His gaze swept across the viewing stones where hundreds of pack members sat in respectful silence, cataloguing faces and scents with the thoroughness of a predator who missed nothing. That golden gaze found Lyra in her corner, and for one impossible moment their eyes met across the expanse of polished stone. Something electric passed between them, not recognition exactly, but something deeper and more primal that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. His wolf stirred inside him. She could somehow sense it, restless and alert in a way that made no sense for a creature looking at a worthless servant. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat before Darius looked away, his attention returning to the ceremonial preparations. But Lyra's weak wolf had suddenly gone very still inside her chest, no longer cowering, but listening to something she couldn't quite hear. "The ancient laws are clear," Elder Keeper Magnus announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent amphitheatre. His staff struck the stones 3 times, each impact echoing like a heartbeat. "Fenrix has served the royal bloodline for 5 centuries, bowing only to those whose blood runs true with the sacred power of our ancestors. Today, he will acknowledge his Alpha King as his ancestors acknowledged the kings before him." The crowd murmured their approval, excited whispers rippling through the viewing stones like wind through tall grass. Children pressed forward on their benches, desperate not to miss a single moment of the legendary ceremony. This was the stuff of stories, the kind of display of power that would be talked about for generations. Seraphina positioned herself where she could be seen by every member of the assembled pack, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. The royal blue of her gown marked her as claimed, as destined, as everything Lyra would never be. When she became Alpha Queen, her first act would probably be to ensure that creatures like Lyra knew exactly where they belonged in the new order. 500 years, Magnus continued, his ancient eyes gleaming with knowledge that stretched back through generations of ceremony and tradition. 500 years of recognition, of the bond between beast and sovereign that cannot be broken by politics or pretension. Fenrix sees what is true, not what is convenient. Darius stepped forward to the ceremonial circle carved into the arena's centre, his boots striking stone with the rhythm of absolute authority. Every line of his massive frame spoke of confidence, of a man who had never doubted his right to command respect from creatures of legend. His wolf prowled restlessly inside him, but that was natural. Any alpha would feel the anticipation of claiming acknowledgement from such an ancient and powerful beast. The great gates at the far end of the arena began to creak open, revealing the shadowy depths of Fenrix's chamber. A sound emerged from that darkness. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something deeper and more primitive that made every person in the amphitheatre feel suddenly, acutely aware of their own mortality. This was the sound of something that had seen kings rise and fall, that had witnessed the birth and death of dynasties. Lyra's wolf was going insane inside her chest, no longer weak and cowering, but alert and focused in a way that made her skin crawl with inexplicable energy. Something was building in her blood, a warmth she had never felt before, as if her very bones were waking up after a lifetime of sleep. It made no sense. Nothing about today made sense. "Behold," Magnus intoned, his voice heavy with reverence and ancient power, "the one who chooses not by decree or politics, but by the truth that flows in sacred blood. Behold Fenrix, guardian of the bloodline, keeper of the ancient covenant between beast and sovereign." The crowd held its collective breath as shapes moved in the shadowy depths beyond the gates. Soon the legendary war beast would emerge to kneel before their Alpha King, and the natural order of things would be confirmed for all to witness. Lyra tried to make herself smaller in her corner, knowing that she had no business witnessing such sacred power. But her weak wolf had gone completely still now, listening to something she couldn't quite hear, waiting for something she didn't understand. The warmth in her blood was growing stronger, spreading through her limbs like liquid fire. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt something stirring inside her that wasn't fear or shame or practiced invisibility, something that felt almost like recognition. The darkness beyond the gates shifted, and then Fenrix emerged into the afternoon sunlight like a nightmare given flesh and bone. He was massive beyond comprehension, larger than any wolf Lyra had ever imagined, his shoulders reaching the height of a grown man's chest. His fur was the colour of storm clouds, silver-grey shot through with streaks of black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ancient scars crisscrossed his hide, each one a testament to battles fought across centuries of service to the royal bloodline. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from every throat in the amphitheatre. They burned like molten gold, ancient and knowing, holding intelligence that stretched back through generations of kings and queens. This was not merely a beast. This was a force of nature, a creature of legend that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. When those golden eyes swept across the assembled crowd, grown alphas shifted uncomfortably on their viewing stones, suddenly reminded of their own mortality. A collective gasp rose from the amphitheatre as Fenrix padded fully into the arena, each massive paw striking stone with the weight of destiny itself. His presence filled the space like a physical force, making the air itself seem thicker, harder to breathe. Children pressed back against their parents, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. This was what power looked like when it moved through the world unrestrained by human politics or social hierarchy. Darius stood perfectly still in the ceremonial circle, every line of his powerful frame radiating confidence and command. He had prepared for this moment his entire life, trained to face creatures of legend without flinching. His wolf prowled restlessly inside him, eager to prove its dominance over even this ancient guardian. The ceremonial armour caught the light as his chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, a king preparing to claim acknowledgement from a beast of legend. Fenrix approached the Alpha King with deliberate, measured steps, his great head held high as he catalogued scents and sounds with supernatural senses. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the moment when the ancient beast would lower his massive head in recognition of royal authority. This was how it had always been, how it would always be, power recognizing power, beast acknowledging sovereign, but something was wrong. Fenrix stopped just outside the ceremonial circle, his massive form towering over even Darius's impressive height. Those molten gold eyes fixed on the Alpha King's face, studying him with an intensity that made the very air crackle with tension. Seconds stretched into eternity as the ancient creature simply stood there, unmoving, his great sides rising and falling with each breath. The expected submission never came. Instead, Fenrix lifted his enormous head and drew in a deep, searching breath, his nostrils flaring as he sampled every scent in the arena. His massive ears swiveled forward, then back, catching sounds that no human ear could detect. The ancient beast was searching for something, testing the air with senses that had been honed across 5 centuries of service to true royalty. Lyra felt the warmth in her blood flare suddenly brighter, spreading through her limbs like liquid fire. Her weak wolf had gone completely still inside her chest, no longer cowering but listening to something she couldn't quite hear. The sensation was overwhelming, terrifying, impossible to understand. Why was her worthless inner beast responding to a creature of such magnificent power? Seraphina's perfect composure began to crack as the seconds stretched on without the expected display of dominance. Her royal blue gown rustled as she shifted uncomfortably, her confident smile wavering at the edges. This wasn't how the ceremony was supposed to proceed. Fenrix should have submitted by now, should have acknowledged Darius as his rightful sovereign. "What's happening?" someone whispered from the viewing stones, their voice barely audible, but somehow carrying in the unnatural silence. "Why isn't he submitting?" another voice added, confusion and growing alarm evident in the quiet words. Magnus gripped his ancient staff tighter, his knowing eyes fixed on Fenrix with an intensity that suggested he understood something the rest of them did not. The old elder's weathered face showed no surprise, only a kind of patient waiting, as if he had been expecting this exact scenario for longer than anyone could imagine. Fenrix's great head turned slowly, those burning golden eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd with methodical precision. He was cataloguing each face, each scent, searching for something specific among the hundreds of pack members who had come to witness his submission to their Alpha King. The ancient creature's supernatural senses missed nothing, catalogued everything, seeking truth that transcended human politics and social hierarchy. Darius took a step forward, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Fenrix, I am your Alpha King. You will acknowledge me." The massive beast's ears flicked toward the sound, acknowledging that he had heard, but his great head did not lower in submission. Instead, those molten gold eyes continued their methodical sweep of the arena, moving past the viewing stones where pack nobility sat in their finery, past the weapon racks where ceremonial blades gleamed in the afternoon sun, moving toward the shadows where a worthless servant girl tried to make herself invisible. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as those ancient knowing eyes found her crouched beside the weapon racks. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment of contact, everything else fading into insignificance. Fenrix stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl with inexplicable energy, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt truly seen by something magnificent. The warmth in her blood exploded into something that felt almost like recognition, almost like welcome, almost like coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost in the wilderness. Her weak wolf wasn't cowering anymore, it was alert, focused, waiting for something that felt inevitable and terrifying and impossible all at once. Fenrix took a step toward her corner, then another. The crowd's whispers died into absolute silence as the legendary war beast turned away from their Alpha King and began walking deliberately across the arena stones. Every footstep echoed like thunder in the unnatural quiet, each impact marking a moment when the impossible became undeniable. He was walking toward Lyra. No one dared breathe. Fenrix crossed the arena with deliberate, earth-shaking steps that seemed to echo in the very bones of every person watching. Each massive paw struck stone with the weight of destiny itself, carrying the ancient beast away from his Alpha King and toward a corner where nothing more important than cleaning supplies and discarded rags should exist. The impossible was happening before their eyes, and no one could process what they were witnessing. Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the amphitheatre could hear it. This couldn't be happening. Creatures like Fenric's didn't notice servants like her. They looked through her as if she didn't exist, just like everyone else. She was nothing, less than nothing, a shadow that cleaned up after her betters and disappeared when her work was done. But those molten gold eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin burn with impossible energy. The warmth in her blood had become a raging fire, spreading through every limb until she felt like she might spontaneously combust from the sheer force of whatever was awakening inside her. Her weak wolf wasn't cowering anymore. It was straining toward the surface, as if recognizing something magnificent approaching. The crowd's shocked whispers began to rise like a tide of confusion and disbelief. What is he doing? Why is he going toward the servants' corner? This has to be some kind of mistake. But their voices seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the pounding of blood in Lyra's ears and the overwhelming presence of the ancient beast bearing down on her position. Seraphina's voice cut through the murmur like a blade dipped in poison. "This is impossible. He must be confused by some sense, some distraction. Darius, command him back to the ceremonial circle where he belongs." But Darius stood frozen in the centre of the arena, his golden brown eyes wide with something that looked almost like recognition. His wolf was going insane inside his chest. She could somehow sense it, whimpering and clawing at his consciousness with desperate need. The Alpha King's carefully controlled composure was cracking at the edges as he watched the legendary guardian beast ignore his authority completely. Fenric stopped directly in front of Lyra, his massive form towering over her crouched figure like a living mountain of fur and muscle and ancient power. Up close, his scars were even more magnificent, each one a story of battles fought in service to true royalty, each mark a testament to centuries of protecting those worthy of protection. His breath was warm against her face, carrying the scent of wild places and ancient magic. And then, slowly, deliberately, with witnesses from across the kingdom watching in stunned silence, Fenrix lowered his enormous head. The submission was unmistakable. The great war beast who had served the royal bloodline for 5 centuries, who had acknowledged kings and queens across generations of rule, was bowing before a powerless servant girl who cleaned stones and accepted insults with practiced silence. The arena erupted in chaos. "Impossible!" Seraphina shrieked, her perfect composure shattered completely. "This is some kind of trick, some deception. She's nobody. She's nothing." Pack members leapt to their feet, their voices rising in confused shouts and demands for explanation. Some called for Magnus to intervene. Others insisted this had to be the result of dark magic or forbidden sorcery. The natural order of their world was being turned upside down before their eyes, and none of them could accept what they were witnessing. But Fenrix remained perfectly still, his great head lowered in unmistakable reverence before the girl everyone had dismissed as worthless. His molten gold eyes stayed fixed on Lyra's face, patient and knowing, as if he had been waiting his entire existence for this moment of recognition. Lyra stared down at the magnificent creature in absolute terror and disbelief. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, some fever dream brought on by too many hours scrubbing stones in the sun. Creatures like Fenrix didn't bow to creatures like her. The universe simply didn't work that way. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's shouting. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. You've made some kind of mistake." Fenrix's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice, and something that might have been warmth flickered in those ancient eyes. He shifted slightly, bringing his massive head closer to her trembling form, and for one impossible moment Lyra felt completely safe, despite the chaos erupting around them. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face showing no surprise at what was unfolding. His ancient staff struck the stones 3 times, the sharp cracks echoing across the arena with enough authority to cut through even the loudest protests. The crowd's shouting died to mutters and whispers as the elder's commanding presence reasserted itself. "Fenrix cannot be deceived," Magnus announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent amphitheatre. "He does not bow to politics or pretension or the convenient arrangements of mortal power. He recognizes only truth, the truth that flows in sacred blood, the truth that transcends human understanding of worth and status." "That's impossible," Seraphina snarled, her royal blue gown whipping around her as she gestured frantically toward Lyra's corner. "She's a servant, a nobody. Her bloodline is nothing, her power is nothing. This beast has been corrupted somehow, influenced by dark magic." But Darius was staring at Lyra with dawning recognition in his golden brown eyes, his wolf clawing desperately at his consciousness as pieces of an impossible puzzle began falling into place. The way his beast had stirred when their eyes met across the arena, the inexplicable pull he had felt toward the shadows where she tried to hide, the way his wolf had gone completely still when Fenrix first emerged, as if waiting for something inevitable to unfold. "The bloodline recognizes the bloodline," Magnus continued, his ancient eyes gleaming with knowledge that stretched back through generations of ceremony and tradition. Royal blood calls to royal blood across centuries, across the artificial barriers erected by those who fear what they cannot control. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. Royal blood? Her? The girl who scrubbed stones and accepted insults and had never been anything more than invisible. It was impossible, insane, the kind of fairy tale desperate servants told themselves to make their lives bearable. But Fenrix remained bowed before her, patient and reverent, his massive form a living testament to truths that transcended human politics and social hierarchy. And deep in her bones, in the fire that was spreading through her blood, something was stirring that felt ancient and powerful and utterly terrifying in its recognition. Something that whispered she had never been worthless at all. Something that whispered she had only been hidden. The arena exploded into pandemonium as the impossible truth settled into the minds of every witness. Hundreds of voices rose in a cacophony of disbelief, anger and confusion that echoed off the stone walls like the sound of their entire world crumbling. Pack members leapt from their viewing stones, some pushing toward the centre of the arena, others backing away, as if proximity to such impossible events might somehow contaminate them with chaos. "This is madness!" Alpha Marcus shouted above the din, his face flushed with outrage. "That creature has been bewitched. No ancient beast bows to a powerless servant. It goes against everything we know about bloodlines and hierarchy." "She must have used dark magic," another voice screamed from the crowd. "Corrupted him somehow with forbidden sorcery. There's no other explanation for this abomination." But even as the accusations flew like arrows, no one could explain how a girl who possessed no measurable power could possibly corrupt a creature of such legendary strength and wisdom. The very idea was absurd, yet here they stood, witnessing Fenrix maintaining his reverent pose before Lyra, while completely ignoring the commands of his rightful Alpha King. Seraphina's perfect composure had shattered completely, her royal blue gown whipping around her as she gestured frantically at the impossible scene. "This is some kind of elaborate deception, a trick designed to undermine the rightful order. Darius, you must put a stop to this immediately. Command your beast to return to his proper place." Her voice cracked with desperation as she spoke, the confidence that had always armoured her now stripped away to reveal the raw fear beneath. If Fenrix could choose a nobody over the Alpha King, if ancient power could recognise worth that transcended social status, then everything Seraphina had built her identity upon was nothing more than convenient lies. Darius stood frozen in the ceremonial circle, his powerful frame trembling with the effort of controlling the chaos erupting inside his own consciousness. His wolf was clawing at him with desperate need, whimpering and howling with recognition that his human mind refused to accept. Every instinct he possessed was screaming that something profound and terrifying and absolutely correct was happening before his eyes. Guards moved uncertainly at the edges of the arena, unsure whether they should intervene or simply bear witness to events that seemed to transcend their authority. Some reached for their weapons, others stood paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. How did you arrest a legendary beast for making the wrong choice? How did you restore order when the very foundations of that order were crumbling? Through it all, Fenrix remained perfectly still beside Lyra, his massive head lowered in unwavering submission. The ancient scars across his hide seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, each mark a testament to his centuries of service to true royalty. His molten gold eyes stayed fixed on Lyra's face with patient devotion, waiting for her to understand what he had recognized the moment he caught her scent. Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her entire body shaking with terror and disbelief. The warmth in her blood had become an inferno, spreading through every limb until she felt like she might burst from the sheer force of whatever was awakening inside her. Her weak wolf was no longer weak. It was straining toward the surface with desperate hunger, as if it had been caged for far too long and finally sensed freedom within reach. "I don't understand," she whispered again, her voice lost in the chaos but somehow heard by the massive creature before her. "Please, there's been some mistake. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I clean floors and scrub stones and disappear when my work is done." Fenrix's great ears flicked toward her voice, and something that might have been sorrow flickered in those ancient eyes. He shifted slightly, bringing his enormous muzzle closer to her trembling hands, and when he spoke, it was with a voice like distant thunder that somehow reached her mind directly. "You have never been nothing, little queen. You have only been hidden." The words crashed through Lyra's consciousness like lightning, impossible and undeniable and absolutely terrifying in their certainty. Queen? Her? The girl who had spent her entire life being told she was worthless, being treated as invisible, accepting cruelty as the natural order of things. But the fire in her blood was spreading, and with it came memories that didn't feel like memories, flashes of images that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. A woman with silver hair and eyes like starlight, pressing a pendant into small hands while tears streamed down her face. Voices whispering urgently about bloodlines and prophecies and the necessity of hiding what could not be destroyed. A sense of power so vast and terrible that it had to be buried deep, wrapped in layers of enchantment that made everyone see weakness where strength lay dormant. "No," Lyra breathed, shaking her head frantically as the impossible images flooded her consciousness. "No, this isn't real. This isn't happening." But Fenrix rumbled softly, a sound of infinite patience and understanding. "The enchantment was necessary, little queen. You were too powerful, too dangerous to those who feared what you might become. They hid your light behind veils of seeming worthlessness, convinced the world that you possessed nothing when you possessed everything." Magnus stepped closer, his ancient staff clicking against the stones as he approached the corner where legend was being rewritten before their eyes. The old elder's weathered face showed no surprise, only a kind of profound satisfaction, as if he had been waiting decades for this moment of revelation. "The bloodline calls to the bloodline," he announced again, his voice cutting through the crowd's shouting with supernatural authority. "Royal blood recognizes royal blood across generations, across the artificial barriers erected by those who profit from deception." "That's impossible!" Seraphina shrieked, her voice rising to nearly inhuman pitches. "Her bloodline is nothing. Her parents were servants. Her grandparents were servants. There is no royal blood in that worthless creature." But Magnus turned those sharp winter eyes on her with something that might have been pity. "What you have been told and what is true are often very different things, child. Those who arranged her concealment were thorough, but they could not fool the ancient ones who remember when the true queen walked among us." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and suddenly Lyra understood why Fenric's eyes held such patient sorrow. He remembered. This ancient creature who had served the royal bloodline for 5 centuries remembered a queen who had been forced to hide her daughter, to wrap her in enchantments that would make her invisible to those who would destroy her for the power she carried. The fire in her blood blazed higher, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt something that wasn't fear or shame or practiced invisibility. She felt the stirring of something magnificent and terrifying and absolutely unstoppable. She felt the awakening of a queen who had been hidden far too long. Magnus raised his ancient staff high above his head, the weathered wood gleaming with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. His voice rang across the chaotic arena with supernatural authority that cut through even the loudest protests, commanding attention from every soul present, whether they wanted to give it or not. Silence! The single word cracked like thunder, and the crowd's shouting died to whispers and mutters as the elder's power reasserted itself over the pandemonium. You will hear the truth that your ancestors knew, the truth that has been hidden by those who profit from deception and convenient lies. Seraphina's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup, but her voice still carried the sharp edge of desperation. Truth? What truth could possibly explain this abomination? That creature bows to a servant girl who possesses no power, no bloodline, no worth whatsoever. It goes against every natural law. Magnus turned those sharp winter eyes on her with something that might have been pity. Child, what you call natural law is nothing more than the artificial order imposed by those who feared what they could not control. Fenrix recognizes no human politics, no convenient arrangements of power. He bows only to the sacred bloodline that flows in royal veins, bloodline that calls to bloodline across generations. The old elder stepped closer to where Lyra crouched beside the massive war beast, his weathered face showing no surprise at the impossible scene. Ancient beasts cannot be deceived by human pretension. They see through veils of enchantment that fool mortal eyes, recognize truth that transcends social hierarchy and political convenience. Enchantment? Alpha Marcus snarled from the viewing stones, his face flushed with outrage. Are you suggesting this worthless servant has been hiding her true nature through magical deception? That's impossible. We would have sensed royal blood, felt the power radiating from her. Magnus smiled with the patient satisfaction of someone who had waited decades to reveal a carefully guarded secret. Would you? When the enchantment was woven by the most powerful sorceresses of the old bloodlines, designed specifically to hide what could not be destroyed, when every spell was crafted to make you see weakness where strength lay dormant, worthlessness where infinite value waited to be awakened. The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each revelation shattering another piece of the identity she had built around her own insignificance. Enchantment? Sorceresses? Royal bloodline? It was impossible, insane, the kind of desperate fantasy that powerless creatures told themselves to make their lives bearable. But the fire in her blood was spreading higher, and with it came more memories that felt like someone else's life entirely. A woman with silver hair and tears streaming down her face, whispering urgent words about hiding and safety and the necessity of becoming invisible. Hands pressing a pendant against her small chest, while voices chanted in languages she didn't recognize. The sensation of something vast and powerful being wrapped in layers of concealment, buried so deep that even she had forgotten it existed. The pendant, Magnus continued, his ancient eyes fixed on Lyra's face with knowing intensity. You remember it now, don't you? Silver and sapphire, warm against your skin until the day it disappeared, taking with it the last conscious memory of who you truly were. Lyra's hand flew to her throat, fingers searching for something that had been missing for so long she had forgotten it ever existed. But she could feel it now, the phantom weight of silver and stone, the warmth that had once pulsed against her skin like a second heartbeat. Her mother's voice echoed across impossible years, whispering words that finally made sense. "You must forget, little star. You must become invisible until it's safe to shine again." "My mother," Lyra whispered, the words barely audible but somehow carrying across the silent arena. "She called me her little star, but she died when I was so young, and I was told she was nothing, nobody, just another servant who couldn't even protect her own child." Magnus's weathered face softened with ancient compassion. "Your mother was Queen Lyralee, last of the Silver bloodline, most powerful sorceress of her generation. She died protecting the secret of your existence, ensuring that you could survive until the day came when hiding was no longer necessary." The revelation crashed through the assembled crowd like a physical wave, setting off another explosion of disbelief and chaos. Queen Lyralee had been legend, myth, a figure from stories told to children about the Golden Age, when magic flowed freely through royal veins. She had disappeared 20 years ago, along with the infant daughter who was supposed to inherit a power that could reshape their world. "That's impossible!" Seraphina shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Lyralee's daughter died with her. Everyone knows the Silver bloodline ended 20 years ago. This is some elaborate deception designed to undermine legitimate authority." But Fenrix rumbled softly, his massive head still lowered in reverent submission before the girl everyone had dismissed as worthless. His molten gold eyes held centuries of memory, and when he spoke, his thunder voice reached every mind in the arena, whether they wanted to hear it or not. "I served her mother, as I served her grandmother, as I served the Silver Queens for 500 years. I know the scent of that sacred bloodline, recognize the power that flows in those royal veins. The enchantment could not fool my ancient senses, only delay the moment when truth would finally be revealed." Darius stood frozen in the ceremonial circle, his powerful frame trembling with the effort of processing revelations that turned his entire understanding of the world upside down. His wolf was going completely insane inside his chest, recognizing what his human mind still struggled to accept. The mate bond he had felt stirring whenever their eyes met across public spaces. The inexplicable pull toward corners where she tried to hide. The way his beast had always grown restless in her presence, as if sensing something magnificent beneath layers of practiced invisibility. "The Silver bloodline," he breathed, the words escaping him without conscious thought. "The most powerful royal line in our history. If she truly carries that blood—" "Then she outranks us all," Magnus finished quietly, his ancient voice carrying absolute certainty. "The Silver Queens ruled when magic flowed freely through our world, when ancient beasts served willingly because they recognized power that came not from dominance, but from the divine right to protect and guide." Lyra felt the fire in her blood blazing higher, and for the first time something that wasn't fear or shame stirred in her chest. The memories were coming faster now, fragments of a childhood filled with power and love, and the kind of magic that made the very air shimmer with possibility. A mother who had called her little star because light poured from her skin when she laughed. Training sessions where she had moved objects with her mind, commanded the elements with gestures, spoken to creatures that normal humans couldn't even see. All of it buried beneath layers of enchantment designed to keep her safe from those who would destroy her for the power she carried. "Step forward, little queen," Magnus commanded gently, his weathered hand extended toward her. "The time for hiding is over. Let them see what has been concealed. Let them witness the return of the bloodline they thought was lost forever." Lyra stared at that outstretched hand, knowing that everything would change the moment she took it. Once she stepped out of the shadows, once she claimed the identity that had been hidden beneath years of cruel invisibility, there would be no going back to the safety of being nobody. But Fenrix rumbled encouragingly beside her, and somewhere deep in her bones she could feel the stirring of power that had waited 20 years for this moment of recognition. She had spent her entire life believing she was nothing, accepting that worthlessness was her natural state. It was time to discover what she truly was. Magnus reached into the folds of his ancient robes and withdrew an object that made the entire arena fall into stunned silence. The relic was impossibly beautiful, a crystalline orb the size of a human heart, shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Ancient runes spiraled across its surface, glowing softly with power that had been waiting centuries for the right bloodline to awaken it. "The heart of Ethan," he announced, his weathered voice heavy with reverence. "Forged in the first days when magic flowed freely through our world, bound to respond only to the true silver bloodline. For 20 years it has remained dormant, waiting for the return of the Queen, who was hidden but never lost." Seraphina's face had gone chalk white, her perfect composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This is madness. That artifact is nothing but legend, myth, stories told to children. It cannot possibly prove anything." But her voice carried the hollow ring of desperation, and everyone present could see the terror in her eyes. If the heart of Ethan truly existed, if it could prove bloodline authenticity beyond any doubt, then everything she had built her identity upon was about to crumble into dust. Magnus extended the relic toward Lyra, his ancient eyes gentle with understanding. "The choice is yours, little queen. You can remain in the shadows where you have learned to survive, or you can step into the light and claim what was always rightfully yours. But know this, once the heart recognizes you, there will be no hiding from those who would either serve you or destroy you." Lyra stared at the crystalline orb with a mixture of terror and desperate longing. Her entire body was trembling, the fire in her blood now blazing so hot she felt like she might spontaneously combust. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to return to the safety of being nobody. But beside her, Fenrix rumbled encouragingly, his ancient presence a steady anchor in the storm of her fear. "What if it doesn't work?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's tense breathing. "What if you're all wrong? What if I really am just a worthless servant who's been caught up in something far beyond her understanding?" Magnus's weathered face softened with infinite compassion. "Then the heart will remain dark, and you will return to the life you have always known. But if I am right, if you are who I believe you to be, then the silver light will blaze forth, and the entire world will finally see what has been hidden for far too long." The crystalline relic pulsed softly in Magnus's outstretched hands, its inner light flickering like a heartbeat, waiting to synchronize with another. The ancient runes seemed to shift and dance across its surface, as if the very artifact was holding its breath in anticipation of this long-awaited moment. Lyra's hands shook as she reached toward the heart of Ethan, her fingers trembling with the weight of a choice that would define not just her future, but the future of everyone watching. The warmth in her blood was spreading through every limb, awakening parts of herself that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten they existed. The moment her fingertips touched the crystalline surface, the world exploded into silver light. Power erupted from the heart of Ethan like liquid starlight, blazing forth with such intensity that half the crowd cried out and shielded their eyes. The silver veins within the crystal flared to life, pulsing with rhythms that matched the sudden racing of Lyra's heart. Ancient runes spun faster across its surface, glowing so brightly they seemed to burn themselves into the very air around them. But the light didn't stop at the relic. It poured into Lyra's hands, up her arms, spreading through her entire body until she blazed like a living constellation. The suppressive enchantments that had hidden her true nature for 20 years began to crack and shatter under the assault of awakening power, each barrier dissolving like ice before flame. Her appearance began to shift subtly but unmistakably. The dull brown of her hair lightened to burnished silver, catching the supernatural light and throwing it back in cascades of luminous beauty. Her pale skin took on an otherworldly glow, as if starlight flowed through her veins instead of blood. Most dramatically, her eyes, those ordinary brown eyes that had always looked down in practiced submission, blazed with silver fire that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The crowd gasped in collective awe and terror as they witnessed transformation beyond their wildest imagination. This was no simple acknowledgement of bloodline. This was the awakening of power that had been deliberately suppressed, the return of magic that had been thought lost forever. Lyra's wolf finally broke free from the chains that had bound it for 2 decades, and when it emerged, it was magnificent beyond description. Silver as moonlight, larger than any normal wolf, with eyes that burned like stars and a presence that made even the ancient Fenricks rumble with approval. This was no weak creature cowering in the shadows. This was a royal wolf, a queen's companion, worthy of the bloodline it served. The silver light blazing from Lyra's transformed form illuminated every corner of the arena, banishing shadows and revealing truth in its purest form. Pack members who had mocked her, dismissed her, treated her as invisible, now stared in stunned recognition of power that dwarfed their own. She stood in the centre of a column of starlight, no longer the cowering servant they had known, but something magnificent and terrible and absolutely undeniable. "Behold," Magnus announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent amphitheatre, "the return of the silver bloodline. Behold Queen Lyra, daughter of Lirelai, heir to the ancient throne, carrier of the power that was hidden but never destroyed." Fenrix lifted his massive head and released a roar that shook the very stones of the arena, not a sound of dominance or threat, but of pure joy and recognition. After 20 years of waiting, after 2 decades of serving lesser powers, he had finally found his true sovereign. The ancient beast's voice echoed across the kingdom, carrying news of the Queen's return to every corner of the realm. Darius stood frozen in the ceremonial circle, his golden brown eyes wide with awe and desperate recognition. His wolf was no longer clawing at his consciousness. It was howling with joy, recognizing not just the return of the silver bloodline, but the awakening of his destined mate. The bond he had felt stirring whenever their paths crossed now blazed to life like a golden thread connecting his soul to hers, impossible to deny or ignore. But it was Seraphina's reaction that truly showed the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The woman who had spent years preparing to be Alpha Queen, who had built her entire identity around her, claimed superiority, collapsed to her knees as the silver light washed over her. Royal blue silk pooled around her like spilled ink, a mockery of the claimed status that had just been revealed as nothing more than political convenience. Lyra stood in the centre of the blazing column of starlight, no longer cowering or hiding or accepting insults with practised silence. The heart of Ethan pulsed in her hands like a living thing, its silver light synchronizing perfectly with the power that flowed through her awakened bloodline. For the first time in 20 years, she was exactly who she was meant to be. The Silver Queen had returned, and nothing would ever be the same. The silver light blazing from Lyra's transformed form began to settle into a steady, otherworldly glow that illuminated every corner of the arena. But as the initial shock of her awakening faded, Seraphina's stunned silence exploded into something far more dangerous than disbelief. Pure, unhinged rage twisted her perfect features into something almost unrecognizable as she struggled to her feet, her royal blue gown torn and stained from her collapse. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria that echoed off the stone walls. "I refuse to accept this deception, this elaborate trick designed to steal what is rightfully mine. I am the chosen Alpha Queen. I have prepared my entire life for this position. Some servant girl with parlour tricks will not take my destiny from me." Her fury was magnificent and terrible. the kind of desperation that came from watching everything you had built your identity upon crumble into dust. She had spent years positioning herself as the perfect mate for Darius, cultivating the right connections, learning the political games that would secure her place as the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Now, a girl who cleaned floors was threatening to destroy it all with nothing more than ancient bloodline and supernatural light. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered voice carrying patient authority. "Child, you cannot rage against truth. The heart of Ethan has spoken, the ancient blood has awakened, and no amount of human protest can change what the gods themselves have decreed." But Seraphina was beyond reason, beyond the careful composure that had always been her greatest weapon. "Gods? Decree? This is nothing but elaborate sorcery designed to undermine legitimate authority. Darius, you cannot possibly accept this madness. Choose duty over delusion. Choose the mate who can truly serve beside you." Darius stood frozen in the ceremonial circle, his powerful frame trembling with the weight of impossible choices. His wolf was howling inside his chest, recognizing the mate bond that blazed between him and the Silver Queen like a golden thread of destiny. But 20 years of political training, of understanding his duties as Alpha King, warred against instincts that demanded he claim what his soul recognized as rightfully his. The hesitation was all Seraphina needed. If words could not restore her crumbling position, if rational argument could not overcome supernatural revelation, then perhaps direct action could destroy the threat before it fully manifested. Her own wolf surged forward, and she shifted with violent efficiency that spoke of years of combat training. Her wolf form was magnificent in its own right, golden brown with silver markings, larger than most females, bred for dominance and trained for battle. But more importantly, she was desperate, and desperation made even civilized creatures capable of extraordinary violence. She launched herself across the arena toward Lyra, with killing intent blazing in her amber eyes. The attack triggered an instant response from multiple sources. Fenrix roared with outrage, his massive form shifting to intercept the assault on his sovereign. Darius's careful control shattered completely as his wolf exploded forward, every protective instinct overriding political calculation. But most shocking of all was Lyra's own response. Power that had been suppressed for 20 years erupted outward in a wave of silver energy that caught Seraphina's wolf form mid-leap and hurled her backward across the arena. The impact was devastating. Seraphina's wolf crashed into the viewing stones with bone-cracking force, her magnificent form crumpling like a broken doll before slowly shifting back to human shape. She lay gasping among the shattered stone, her royal blue gown now torn beyond recognition, her perfect hair matted with blood and debris. Lyra stared at her own hands in shock and terror. Silver energy still crackled around her fingers, residual power from the instinctive defense that had required no conscious thought or training. She had never used magic like that before, never commanded power with such devastating efficiency. The suppressive enchantments hadn't just hidden her bloodline. They had contained abilities that were clearly far beyond anything she had imagined. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice carrying easily across the stunned silence that had fallen over the arena. "She was going to attack me, and it just happened. I didn't know I could do that." Magnus's ancient eyes gleamed with satisfaction and something that might have been pride. "The silver bloodline has always been defensive in nature, little queen. Your ancestors protected rather than conquered, shielded the innocent rather than dominated the weak. What you just displayed was not aggression, but instinctive protection of yourself and others." The crowd had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on the impossible scene before them. A servant girl who had spent her life accepting insults and abuse had just casually deflected an attack from one of their most powerful females. The casual display of defensive magic spoke to depths of power that most of them couldn't even comprehend. Darius approached slowly, his golden brown eyes wide with awe and something deeper, recognition of the mate bond that now blazed between them like a living thing. His wolf had gone quiet inside his chest, no longer fighting against political obligation, but simply content to be near the female who carried his soul's other half. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard from their commanding Alpha King. Lyra shook her head, still staring at her hands where silver energy continued to flicker like captured starlight. "I don't understand what's happening to me. 20 years of being nothing, and now I can feel power in every breath, magic flowing through my veins like liquid fire. How was this hidden so completely?" "Because your mother was the most powerful sorceress of her generation," Magnus answered, his weathered face showing ancient compassion. "She wrapped you in layers of concealment so complete that even you believed the lies they created. But enchantments can only suppress truth for so long, and when faced with mortal danger, your true nature will always emerge to protect you." Seraphina struggled to sit up among the broken stones, her perfect features now marked with cuts and bruises that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. But even broken and bleeding, her voice carried the sharp edge of desperate fury. "This changes nothing. She may possess some sorceress bloodline, but I am still the chosen mate, still the rightful Alpha Queen. Darius, remember your duties. Remember the political alliances that depend on our union." The plea hung in the air like a challenge, and every person in the arena held their breath, waiting to see how their Alpha King would respond. Would he choose the comfortable path of political convenience, or would he acknowledge what his wolf and every ancient law proclaimed as true? Guards had begun moving uncertainly around the edges of the arena, unsure whether they should intervene in what had clearly become a supernatural crisis far beyond their authority. Some reached towards Seraphina as if to help her, others positioned themselves protectively around the viewing areas where pack nobility sat in stunned silence. But Lyra was no longer the cowering servant who had cleaned these stones that morning. Silver light continued to flow around her transformed form, and when she looked at the woman who had just tried to kill her, there was something regal and terrible in her star-bright eyes. "You attacked me," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that made even the guards pause in their movements. "In front of witnesses, before the eyes of the Ancient Ones, you tried to murder someone whose only crime was accepting a truth you refused to acknowledge." The words settled over the arena like a judgment, and suddenly everyone present realized they had witnessed not just a failed assassination attempt, but an act of treason against royal blood. The political game had just become something far more serious, and the consequences would reshape everything they thought they knew about power and authority. The Silver Queen had awakened, and she was no longer hiding. The arena had fallen into a silence so profound that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the weight of the moment. Darius stood at the crossroads of destiny, his powerful frame trembling with the force of opposing obligations that threatened to tear him apart. 20 years of political training warred against the mate bond that blazed between him and the Silver Queen like a living flame, demanding recognition that could not be denied or ignored. The golden thread connecting their souls pulsed with each heartbeat, growing stronger and more insistent with every passing second. His wolf was no longer fighting the connection. It was howling with desperate need, recognizing the other half of itself in the transformed woman who blazed with starlight. The bond was complete, whether he acknowledged it or not, burning through his consciousness like liquid fire that could not be extinguished. Seraphina struggled to her feet among the broken stones, her torn gown and bloodied face a stark reminder of how completely her world had crumbled in the span of minutes. But even broken and defeated, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage the political alliance that had defined her entire existence. "Darius," she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation that echoed off the arena walls. "Remember your duties as Alpha King. Remember the political balance that keeps our kingdom stable. You cannot throw away decades of careful alliance for the sake of supernatural fantasy. Choose responsibility over romance, duty over desire. Her words carried the weight of everything he had been taught since childhood, that an Alpha King's personal wants must always be secondary to the needs of his people, that political stability mattered more than individual happiness, that duty was the highest virtue a leader could possess. For 20 years, those lessons had guided every decision he made. But his wolf was done listening to human politics. The mate bond snapped fully into place with a sensation like lightning striking the very core of his being. Power flowed between him and Lyra in waves that made the air itself shimmer with golden energy, creating a visible connection that no amount of political manoeuvring could sever. The recognition was so profound, so absolutely correct, that denying it would be like trying to deny the existence of his own heartbeat. Darius looked at Lyra, truly looked at her for the first time, without the filters of social hierarchy clouding his vision. She stood in a column of silver light, no longer the invisible servant who had cleaned his floors, but a queen in her own right, carrying bloodline that predated his own dynasty by centuries. Her star-bright eyes held power that could reshape their world, but more than that, they held the other half of his soul. The choice ceased to be a choice at all. Without breaking eye contact with his destined mate, Darius began to move across the arena with steps that carried the weight of absolute decision. Each footfall rang against stone with the finality of fate itself, marking the moment when supernatural truth finally overrode human politics. His golden brown eyes blazed with recognition and something deeper, the fierce possessiveness of a wolf who had finally found his missing piece. "No," Seraphina breathed, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying across the silent amphitheatre. "No, you cannot possibly—" But Darius was already kneeling. The Alpha King of the most powerful pack in the known world lowered himself to one knee before the Silver Queen, his head bowed in acknowledgement of sovereignty that transcended political appointment. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, gasps and whispers rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. This was unprecedented, impossible, a complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about power and hierarchy. "My queen," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. "I have spent my life in service to duty and political necessity, but I will not deny what every fibre of my being recognises as truth. You are my mate, my destined partner, the other half of my soul. I choose you over convenience, truth over comfort, love over political alliance." The words rang through the arena with the force of an oath, binding and irreversible. Lyra stared down at the most powerful man in the kingdom, kneeling at her feet, her star-bright eyes wide with wonder and terror at the magnitude of what was happening. The invisible servant who had accepted insults with practiced silence was being claimed by the Alpha King himself, acknowledged as his equal in front of hundreds of witnesses. Fenrix released a roar of pure triumph that shook the very foundations of the arena, his ancient voice echoing across the kingdom to announce that the natural order had finally been restored. The legendary warbeast's joy was infectious, spreading through the crowd as pack members began to understand they were witnessing history being rewritten before their eyes. Magnus stepped forward, his ancient staff clicking against the stones as he approached the kneeling Alpha King and his Silver Queen. The elder's weathered face showed profound satisfaction, as if he had been orchestrating this moment for decades and was finally seeing his careful plans come to fruition. "Behold," he announced, his voice carrying supernatural authority that commanded attention from every soul present. "The true mating of equals, the union of gold and silver bloodlines that will restore balance to our world. Let none question what the ancient powers have decreed, what the mate bond has confirmed, what royal blood has called to royal blood." The crowd began to stir with excitement and awe, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple change in political alliance. This was the restoration of bloodlines that stretched back to the founding of their civilization, the return of power that had been thought lost forever. But it was Darius's next words that truly showed the depth of his commitment to the impossible choice he had made. Rising from his kneeling position, but remaining close enough to touch her, he addressed the assembled crowd with the authority of absolute command. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree. "I reject all previous political arrangements. Seraphina of the Northern Pax is no longer welcome in this court, no longer recognized as having any claim to royal status. My mate, my queen, is she who stands before you, blazing with the silver light of her ancestors." The formal rejection sent another shockwave through the crowd, but this time it was accompanied by sounds of approval and recognition. Pack members who had witnessed Seraphina's attack, who had seen her attempt to murder royal blood out of jealous desperation, began to nod their agreement with the Alpha King's judgment. Seraphina collapsed completely, the last of her strength finally giving way under the weight of absolute defeat. The royal blue gown that had once marked her as claimed now pooled around her like spilled ink, a mockery of status that had been revealed as nothing more than political convenience. Lyra felt the golden thread connecting her to Darius pulse with warmth and recognition, and for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to be truly seen by someone who mattered. The mate bond was complete, acknowledged, irreversible. She was no longer alone in a world that had dismissed her as worthless. She was claimed by the Alpha King himself, and nothing would ever be the same.